So here's the thing. I'm a big fan of art. I like making it, I like looking at it, and I especially like learning about art history. Now, this wouldn't be a problem, except that fantasy authors keep making the protagonists of their books artists. And like 9 times out of 10, they're really bad. I think there are multiple reasons for this, and I will be breaking those down in this video, as well as kind of discussing every single artist protagonist that I have read in a fantasy book, and I have sought them out. I really want them to redeem themselves, and they very rarely do. And then finally, I'm going to lead you through what I think are the missed opportunities in these books and how I think artists as protagonists could be handled better in a fantasy setting. So, let's dive in. Okay, so I truly believe in my heart of hearts that authors keep making artists the protagonists of their book because of the kind of romantic notions and stereotypes that we currently have about artists. It seems nice. It conjures poetic images of some romantic and passionate artist in their studio in France, finding the true essence of their subject, you know? However, if you take 2 seconds to think about it logically, you're signing up for a needlessly difficult task. Art is very sensory. It's visual if we're talking about traditional art forms like painting, sculpture, drawing, and usually if we're talking about fantasy books, that's generally the type of art that the artists do. That means that you're going to have to spend a lot of your precious word count on describing the art if you want it to actually mean anything. Now, most people who aren't me don't really want to read blocks of text describing what the art actually looks like for example the texture, the paintbrush strokes, the color choice, the modulation, the three-dimensionality, for example, but it's necessary if we're going to understand what the art actually looks like. And we need to understand what the art looks like if we're going to actually discern anything about the artists themselves and the world that they live in. And even then, it's not going to be a great representation. One thing that was stressed in my art history classes is the importance of actually being able to see the piece. It was why for most of our essays, even our research essays, we would have to choose something that we could go to see in person, because even if we're just doing research, it's important to do a proper visual analysis, and we're not able to conceptualize three-dimensionality or texture or scale if we're only seeing it on a 2-dimensional image. So that means that there's a lot of information about the piece that we're missing out on. And in fiction, we don't even get images. It all has to be conjured through the written word. Now you may be like, Jordan, literally who cares? I just default to some vague notion of hyperreality born from our Western obsession with the Renaissance. And like, fair, I guess. But let's dissect that a little bit. And to do that, I will be bringing back the blackboard. So art from the Renaissance didn't grow up in a vacuum. It came from a long history and evolution of art that was shaped by science and politics and war and societal values dating back to prehistory. The Renaissance was a period of rediscovery of the arts and philosophies of the Greeks and Romans. The Romans were prominently influenced through both trade and war by the Greeks, the Etruscans, and the Egyptians, though there were of course other influences, and those influences had influences. The Romans at first were extremely interested in portraiture inspired by the Hellenistic Greek period, which included a wider variety of subjects like the less idealized forms of older people and poor people. This was then remixed to create busts of Roman patricians, basically rich old Roman men with political power, whose wrinkles were accentuated to show wisdom, which was valued in Roman society. This changed with Augustus, who was too young for this, so he therefore looked back to earlier Greek art, specifically the classical period, which used highly idealized forms, generally of gods and goddesses. He appropriated the style for political propaganda and changed Roman art forever in so doing. This style is what the Renaissance was most interested in. While they sometimes used these idealized forms in their representations of Greek myth, oftentimes they were recontextualized to represent their new faith, Christianity. This was also a period that was deeply concerned with science and math, so it was these interests that led to the creation of linear perspective, which was a new way to represent depth through mathematics, that is closer to how the human eye perceives depth. This was coupled with the creation of oil paint, which allowed for semi-translucent application of paint to be layered to create soft transitions from light to shadow. Instead of art being used for political propaganda like the Romans, although that was still present, it was mostly used for religious favor. Powerful families would commission art for churches and of religious figures to gain favor with the church. Socially, it was unacceptable again to depict women and men in the nude, especially women, unless it was through mythical context because of the religious standards of modesty. And this doesn't even touch on the Northern European Renaissance art. These are all artistic elements that are inseparable from the social, political, technological, and historical contexts. So if your world doesn't have a focus on science, math, and optics, then it likely wouldn't have developed linear perspective or maybe even a proper understanding of anatomy. If it's more in the true medieval period, then there's a likelihood that they wouldn't be using oil paint, they would instead be using tempera. Is there a religion that values modesty like Christianity does, or is there a focus and valuing of the nude form like they do in ancient Greek art? So, how does this apply to your loosely medieval fantasy fave? Well, usually it doesn't, and that's the issue. Because not everyone wants to read blocks of text about what the artist's art actually looks like, it's usually left up to the viewer's interpretation. And unfortunately, that's a huge missed opportunity when it comes to characterizing the world and society of the book. And that's a huge waste when it comes to the artists themselves, because if we don't understand what other art looks like, we can't understand what their personal style is and how it relates or differs from other art, if at all. The artist then becomes an aesthetic. They have a vague passion for color and maybe dissecting the human face, especially their love interests. And almost without a doubt, there will come a point where they suggest that they could just never mix all the colors of their love interest's eye. But that doesn't mean or say anything about anyone, really. It's a cheap tool. So basically, you're damned if you do describe the art, and you're also damned if you don't. But now I think it's time that we looked at how some of these books tackled their artist protagonists. I'm going to start with the worst and work my way towards the best, but please note that I'm not actually talking about the quality of the book itself and don't really touch on the story much. It's really just focused on the artist and how the art operates within the story. We're gonna start out with the worst, which in my opinion has to be Feyre from A Court of Thorns and Roses. And before you come for me, I have only read the first book in the series, and while I value doing my research, you literally could not pay me to read another book by Sarah J. Maas. And trust me, I know that for a fact because my A Court of Thorns and Roses review is the highest grossing video on my channel and I'm not even slightly enticed to read on. So we're gonna have to make do with the first book, and I apologize if this has been rectified in later books. But why is Feyre particularly bad? Well, to start, her art is exceptionally vague. Some of the others that I'm going to be talking about give enough context clues with the world that we kind of understand what the art would look like, but with Feyre, because she spends so much time in the Fey court, which is like a high fantasy made-up place that isn't really based on anything, it's like obviously vaguely European, but that's kind of the best we get. So we don't really understand what period it might be modeled after, if any, or what the art actually looks like at all, because it's all made up and not described to us whatsoever. A lot of the focus of the description is on color, but it doesn't even get specific with that, and instead the author just notes that Feyre notices the color without giving us details on what those colors look like or how they're applied. The art therefore serves no purpose in characterizing either Feyre or the world, but the issue is it also doesn't really serve the plot. It doesn't need to, but because it didn't serve in any other way, that would have been nice. Like, for example, at the end of the book, Feyre goes through some trials, and I kind of expected the art to play a role in those, but it never did, so it just kind of felt like a pointless element that was added, especially because it's emphasized so much throughout the book that Feyre is an artist and has a passion for art, but the lack of specificity then makes it very, very aggravating because we don't actually understand what it looks like. It also doesn't even really operate as a base level aesthetic characterization, in that a lot of books that have artist protagonists will use it as a way to kind of color the descriptions of the worlds by using terminology or referencing artists or whatever, but it doesn't even really do that. I think it would have been interesting in this book to see a kind of clear differentiation between Feyre as a human artist and the art of the fairy world. That way it could have both characterized where humanity is at, but also what the fairy world is kind of at and their aesthetic desires, their stylistic choices based on their society, you know? An example where I think this would have really paid off was at one point the author does a kind of info dump based on a mural that represents like a historical event. And I think that a way that she could have done it more subtly was to describe the art itself and let the historical context kind of seep through in that description so that we absorb the historical context and what happened in those events without just being explained with no reference as to what the art even looks like. Because that way it would have been a subtle use of information dumping that would have also helped to color the art in the world. But yeah, we get none of that and it was kind of bad. Next up we have Tobias from the Savior's Champion, and I've already spoken about this issue in the video that I did reviewing the book as well, so that's already up on my channel, but I do want to touch on it again. The reason that I rank it above ACOTAR is because we have enough context clues from the world that we have a vague understanding of what the art would look like. Now that's not because the author had well-written descriptions of what the art actually looks like, but instead we just understand that the statues are kind of vaguely idealized and it is a world that is loosely inspired off of ancient Greece, so we can kind of place it within the classical Greek period. This, however, places the heavy lifting on the reader of the book rather than on the author and forces them to draw upon their knowledge of what Greek art actually looks like. It also doesn't characterize the differences in the world through the art. Sethusan has a different religion and political system than ancient Greece, but these changes are not accounted for in the art world. Instead of the polytheism of the Greek pantheon of gods, we have more of a singular religious figure in the Savior. This would drastically alter both the subject matter and the representation of the art, where we would likely see depictions closer to that of the Virgin Mary than those of the Greek gods. She would act as a religious icon. She also serves as the ruler of Thesan, so not only is she a religious figure, but a powerful political figure. This also differs from the classical Greek period and would be closer to the portraiture that we would see in later periods. It opens the door to political propaganda. The Savior is a position that is inherited through maternal bloodlines, therefore there is no one true depiction of the Savior, as there are multiple figures who have held that title. That leaves room for the way that the figure is represented to change throughout the course of their history, especially as it is portraiture, so each would likely have a preference in the way that they would like to be represented, as we see with the European monarchs throughout history. This leaves so much room for nuance, but it is not at all explored in the way that the author approaches the art or the world building. Moving on, I'd like to next talk about Clary from the Mortal Instruments. Now, I don't think by any stretch she is as bad as Tobias or Feyre, but she is still not great. So unlike the previous two, this is actually a contemporary fantasy series, and I think that really helps the author out. On top of that, the author also really commits to the fact that art isn't the only thing that Clary cares about. It's not her only personality trait, which is good. However, I think she goes a little too far with that because in the end, Clary as an artist is kind of just abandoned. While the type of art isn't super specific, we do understand that her style verges on hyper-realism in her sketches, but she also does dabble in graphic design, which we know because we see her design the van for her friend Simon's band. Then, when she becomes aware of the fantasy world, this manifests in a new way, and basically she has an aptitude for drawing runes, and runes are basically something that they draw on their skin to give special kind of magical abilities to the shadow hunters. Now, if I have one main critique of this series is that I think Cassandra Clare should have made Clary just a graphic designer or someone who's interested in graphic design or calligraphy. Hear me out. Those are actual transferable skills when it comes to the runes. In the books, they're kind of described as these like thin lines that seem to be loosely inspired by Asian forms of calligraphy in their shapes and in the way that the lines work. Because of this, and because of the saturation of artist protagonists, I would argue that it would be so much more interesting if Clary was interested in fonts, in graphic design, in tattooing, or in graffiti. One thing that I do like about this series is that Clary's mom is also an artist, and she prefers the use of paint over drawing, so I like that they actually practice different mediums, but it's something that they're able to bond over. This also comes to play in the plot of the first book, but I won't tell you how, because spoilers. But as mentioned, Clary as an artist kind of gets abandoned as the series progresses, and I can understand why. Once the fantasy elements pick up, her life becomes a lot more dangerous, and art isn't really like life or death for the most part, besides the runes, which is like a different kind of art. But besides a few times where I think Clary draws or something as a way to like calm down, it's not something that's really explored much in the context of the story. That's why I think a shift of focus maybe within the story to her being more interested in calligraphy or the studying of fonts or graphic design or graffiti or tattooing would have been an interesting twist on the artist protagonist, something that's much more unique and also something that is relevant to the actual world of the story. Now, next up, I do want to talk about two artist protagonists that I genuinely really enjoyed as artist protagonists. I didn't actually enjoy either of these books that much, but I do think that they handled the use of an artist character very well within the context of the story. I also want to use them as kind of case studies because they approach it in very different ways, so I think it can be useful if there are writers that are considering having an artist protagonist that are watching this video, because you can kind of reference them as different ways that you can approach the use of the artist protagonist. In one, it's a central part of the plot and the world, whereas in the other, it's used primarily as a way to characterize the main character. So let's get into it. Okay, so in the Firebird trilogy, the first book of which is 1,000 Pieces of You, Marguerite, our protagonist, is an artist. Shock, I know. The series is about traveling through different dimensions, and that's where this gets interesting. That means that she ends up visiting multiple different versions of herself. While her art is never really plot important throughout the duration of the series, it is a powerful tool that the author used for characterization. What I mean is, she figures out information about the universe, but also about herself through the differentiation of her art practice in these different worlds. For example, in some worlds she might not have the same access to materials, while in others the use of line or color might represent a different state of mind or well-being. She's able to do this in only a couple lines of description, and that's because we have a frame of reference of understanding for what the art looks like from our actual protagonist. That way, when there are differences, we can intuit why those might be. I also like that it's not her whole personality, but that being said, it is definitely something that you can tell that she cares about. She has bigger things to deal with in the same way that Clary does, but that doesn't mean that she just abandons her interest in art. Oftentimes this manifests through the descriptions, with comparisons to other art, paintings, artists, tools, techniques, and that way it really shows that there is a care from the protagonist and the author in doing research, and it also helps to better describe the world and give, tone and context in that regard. I really appreciate that level of attention to detail. That is also true for the other character that I want to talk about. Isobel from An Enchantment of Ravens is a portrait artist. Now this is another one of those situations where it does definitely rely a little bit more on context clues rather than specifically spelling out what the actual art looks like, but I think it does it well enough that we're able to get fairly specific with our understanding of what the art actually looks like. The author leaves it fairly vague, but we understand that this is similar to European oil paintings. Unfortunately, we don't know what century it would resemble most, but we understand that it would likely look like Western European portrait paintings from the 17th to early 19th century. That's when there was a rise in the traditional kind of monarch and nobility portraiture that we're fairly familiar with in the West. We can also pick up on some interesting context clues about the world through the use of description. For example, at one point Isobel compares the trees in the forest while she's walking through to flying buttresses. This implies that the world has Christianity, as this was a prominent feature of Gothic cathedrals. Basically what happened is, after the fall of the Romans, Europe forgot how to make concrete, which is a material that is both durable and relatively light. This led to a long period where churches were made from wood or stone. Not many of these early churches survive, and it wasn't until the rediscovery of Roman architecture, and specifically the arch, that we begin to see Romanesque architecture. These churches usually have a barrel vault as the roof of the church, but again, due to how heavy stone is, they usually have extremely thick walls and very few windows in order to support the roof. This means that there is very little natural light and leaves the space feeling kind of heavy. And then one day, my man Abbot Suger from the Ile-de-France region said, let there be light. Basically, he believed that colored light produced by stained glass brought the soul closer to faith and to God. Unfortunately, the thick walls of Romanesque architecture wouldn't allow for the amount of light that this man wanted. He therefore employed architects to develop and steal new technologies in order for churches to reach taller heights with thinner walls and more surface area. This was in part made possible by the Crusades and taking elements of design from the Middle East. One of these tools and techniques was the flying buttress, which is an external support designed to drive the force out and downwards without disturbing the flow of light into the building. So this also implies that Gothic architecture was prevalent enough for her to use it as a description within the world of the book. So that, accompanied with the name Isobel, which is a French name that means pledged to God, implies that this book is set in a world that is kind of based loosely off post-Renaissance Catholic France. Therefore, I would imagine that her portraiture looks something like this. Now again, this wasn't really spelled out, and I needed to rely on my knowledge of art history to kind of pull this many threads together to kind of get the specific understanding. However, as I mentioned earlier, while there were nuances, a lot of the kind of portrait paintings looked fairly similar until we get to like the Rococo period. So we get a good enough understanding of the art that we can kind of conjure images in our minds. Isobel as an artist is a pivotal part of the plot of this book. She basically paints for the fairy court and is one day commissioned to do a painting of a fairy prince, and she accidentally paints human emotion into his eyes, which is a big no-no because fairies are not supposed to have human emotions. So that kind of kicks off the plot of the story. However, I really like that it isn't abandoned once the plot kicks off, and instead she kind of paints as a currency throughout the duration of the book, and it even comes to play at the end of the book, which I also won't give any specifics for because spoilers. It's refreshing. We very rarely get a protagonist that is an artist in a fantasy book where art actually holds value and has plot significance in the actual world of the story. Generally, because art isn't life or death, it kind of just gets abandoned, or like I said, just kind of serves an aesthetic value in the description of the world or in our understanding of the character. Therefore, I thought it was fascinating the way that the author wove in the painting as a significant part of the conflict of the book. One thing that I also want to commend the author for is that it's very clear that she's done her research when she's talking about the tools, the techniques, the styles, and the way that she incorporates that into the descriptions of the world, because then it doesn't feel like she's showing off that knowledge. It's integrated really well into the story, and yeah, it doesn't really distract or take away. I think that anyone who is interested in writing a artist protagonist in a fantasy book or series should definitely read this book to see the way that Margaret Rogerson tackles the characterization of the character in the world. I guess that's a good place to segue into the final part of this video, where I'm basically going to touch on things that I think are missed opportunities or that could be handled better in the approach to writing artists as protagonists. While I firmly believe that you are making your job harder if you so choose to write an artist protagonist, I also think that there are a lot of ways that it can be done really well, and most of these I haven't seen before. So these are just opinions, but here's how I think that we could improve upon these characters moving forward. Let's start out with contemporary fantasy series. Now, this is a fun one because I think there are so many ways that this could be done right, because we already have a firm grasp on what art looks like in the world because we've lived it. We don't need to create a whole new history for art. We understand what that looks like, but we get to play within that with how the art is a part of the plot, or maybe different ways that the art manifests in the fantasy, you know, kind of underbelly or whatever, fantasy part of the world. Like we see, for example, in Harry Potter, where the portraits come to life. That's a nice little tidbit. And it also means that there are a ton of more contemporary styles of art that have developed since the Industrial Revolution. For example, this could be sculptures made out of found objects, and maybe one of those objects that they find has some plot significance, or as mentioned with Clary, it could be tattooing, it could be graffiti, it could be printmaking. There's also performance art, embroidery, collage, cartooning, and a million other different amazing art practices. If you are absolutely married to the idea of the artist as a painter, I would also recommend just making it anything but hyperrealism. Anything else. That could be, you know, surrealism. It could be, there are so many interesting movements since the Industrial Revolution that could be such interesting approaches to the way that the artist actually does art. That does mean, though, that you're gonna have to do research into what each of these movements kind of means and where they came from, because a lot of them stem from different historical, ideological, conceptual, and social kind of moments in history that are very specific. But they can really touch on some really interesting emotions and ideas that are not just hyperrealism. Ugh! That is just the bare minimum to make it slightly more unique. There's also film, photography, and animation, which I haven't really seen explored as much in contemporary fantasy. And this opens up a ton of potential for very new and unique ideas. One of the ways in which this could manifest in an interesting way is, for example, a common trope is where the protagonist is the only one that can see this kind of fantasy world. But what if they were a photographer and the only way that normal people could see it is through the photos that they capture? But then because of Photoshop, no one believes them. They all just think that it's photoshopped. I thought that could be like a really interesting way to tackle that. And another interesting thing is if it was like a darker fantasy with more of a mystery element. Maybe there are things that appear in the photos and patterns, whatever, that, you know, don't appear in real life. That feels like a kind of horror trope, but it could be interesting to play with in a fantasy setting. What I'm saying is this: authors of contemporary fantasy have no excuse as to why they can't get more specific and more tailored to their world with the way that the artist approaches art, if that makes sense. I feel like there's a lot of room for more specificity and more tailored art practices to what the actual fantasy elements of the world look like, you know? But now let's move on to high fantasy, because this is where I think you have the hardest task, but also the most room to do something interesting. First of all, as mentioned, just do your research, baby. It's really not that hard, and if you are going to base your fantasy world on a, you know, a historical place or period or whatever, you need to not only understand what the art looked like in that period, but also why they had those materials, those tools, those techniques, those styles, and what that said about the politics, the society, and who they were in contact with. So when you're building your own fantasy world, if you want to have an artist protagonist, you should consider not only the specific country or kingdom where the main character, you know, is, but also if they are at war with a country, if they have conquered a country, if they have a trading agreement with a nearby country, then that would also influence the approach to art, because oftentimes ideas get exchanged and that kind of trickles into the way that the art is approached. You also need to consider what your culture in this society kind of values. Is it strength and youth? Because then you should focus on idealism. Is it wisdom? Then you should focus more on naturalism. These are all things that will definitely help to color your world, that can say a lot about the society without saying things about the society. Art can be such a powerful tool in gaining an anthropological understanding of what a place is like without actually having to literally break it down in the text, and that's something that I don't see employed enough with artist protagonists. You should also think about the subjects of the art. Is there a prominent religion? Because if there is, then in that case, there's probably going to be a lot of art centered around religious figures and mythology. And if the focus is more on, you know, warfare and politics, then you can do portraiture of the upper classes and nobility and monarchy. Also art for decor for palaces or for public spaces. So there's really a lot of opportunity. Coin making is another example. If you look at Roman art, there are so many ways that the Romans integrated art into their society, and I think that's a really good way to understand the different types of artists and artisans also that were prevalent in earlier societies. Also, please consider art that is not just European art. I swear, if I see another artist protagonist that is based out of Greece, Rome, or just vaguely Europe. There are so many beautiful types of art from all over the world with rich histories that say a lot about those societies. So if you're writing a world where there are multiple different societies and you want one of them to have an artist protagonist, please consider the one that is not frickin' European. Because as far as I'm aware, it hasn't been explored in fantasy. So do better. So now let's get specific with stories that I personally would love to see and ways in which the art can influence the, characters and story itself. One thing that I will say is that recently we have this very romanticized notion of what an artist is. You picture someone painting sunsets in a field. It's very TikTok-esque. But historically, artists are some of the most messed up asshole people ever. They're assholes. All of them are so just mentally not okay. One of my favorite examples of this is Bernini, who basically was having an affair with this lady named Constanza, who was the wife of another artist, and then Constanza had an affair with Bernini's younger brother Luigi, and Bernini found out and literally chased Luigi through the streets of Rome, trying to kill him, and then ordered his assistant to go and slash Constanza's face with a razor, which he did multiple times, and then Constanza got jailed for adultery, and Bernini got exonerated by the Pope. And that's why we need to crush the patriarchy, baby! But that is also not a one-off story. That's the usual. So I would argue that maybe this isn't what you want for your protagonist, and it would definitely change the vibe of the story. But if you want to write an artist as a prominent character in your story, I would love to see some egotistical, messed up, emotional rage monster that are the artists of most of history. But then let's look at political fantasy, because historically art has played a very crucial role in political propaganda, and especially so before the, mass populations were literate. Symbolism is a very powerful tool, and when used right can say a lot about a ruler and convince people of certain things about that ruler. So throughout history, there are many rulers that have used this to their advantage, such as Emperor Augustus and Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler, none of whom are good people, however they knew what they were doing, which is bad. So I guess take that with a grain of salt. But my point is, I would love to see an artist protagonist who is maybe commissioned by an evil ruler to do political propaganda art, and then they have to do moral conflict when they're painting this. Maybe they can put in hidden messages. I think that could be fun. That could be spicy, if it goes against their morals, but then also they're being threatened and they live in a society, I think that's kind of juicy. Also, another thing that could be considered is if there is the invention of the printing press already in your world, then they could be doing art as political propaganda for the underdog nation or for the rebellion or whatever. And if you want more inspo for the printing press and how art can be done in the printing press, look at Albert Dürer, who is also insane and so egotistical, but I love that man. So that's your homework. Art can also be used as a way to understand a society or history, as mentioned previously. So a way that this could manifest is maybe an artist protagonist going to a neighboring nation, even a nation that they're at war with, and having to understand that nation through doing art that is, I don't know, maybe an amalgamation of the two, or studying under someone who is an artist from that nation and gaining a better understanding of their culture. There's lots of really interesting things that could be done with that I also haven't seen. It's also worth considering art as cultural preservation, and I think an interesting example of this is World War II, where art was very much valued by Adolf Hitler, so it was kind of protected in the war, whereas there are a lot of wars that focus on cultural genocide or actual genocide, where they might be targeting art and artifacts as a way to erase that person, or that society's, I guess, culture and cultural understanding and history. That's kind of another interesting thing that hasn't really been explored that I was actually considering exploring in one of my own stories and might still, because I think art as cultural preservation is really interesting in war times specifically, and I would love to see a story explore that. Also, if it's a romantic fantasy, then I would love to see a story that's kind of in the vein of Portrait of a Lady on Fire, where maybe someone is commissioned to do the portrait of a ruler and they fall in love, although that ruler is then betrothed to someone else and they're commissioned to do like the portrait that they send to the person that the ruler's like betrothed to. I think that's kind of spicy, and I would love to see that explored in a fantasy setting. And then also, where is the story where a sculptor sculpts a statue and it comes to life and they fall in love? I've seen photos and paintings and digital art of people making out with statues, and I think it's kind of hot, and I would love to see it in real life. So that's that. My point is, there is a lot of ways that this can be approached that are fresh and unique and explore art in a new and interesting way. And I would love to see how that is handled in future books. I'm hoping that we can kind of progress past this kind of vanilla, artist as a painter, it gets thrown to the wind when the fantasy elements take hold, etc., etc. But that is all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this very long video. If you did, then please like and subscribe, and I would love to hear your thoughts about artist protagonists in the comments down below. It's obviously something that I'm very interested in, and so I'd love to hear your take on whether or not they've been done right, or if there's any books that I missed, or yeah, kind of what your stance is, and if you think that there are any other ways that it could be done better in the future. But that is all I have for you today. I will see you next time. Bye!